Greetings good people and a very warm welcome to you all. Today I have a rollie on the bench that looks like it was standing too close to someone teeing off at the 18th. Look at that broken sapphire glass that has sneaked onto the movement via that calendar aperture. So I have to be very careful not to give that glass any sort of excuse to scratch things up, especially on that gorgeous, delicate jet black dial. There are a lot of scratches on this 40mm case and oyster bracelet, but the overall condition is great. But I want to make this thing look new, so keep watching for the polishing segment as I use various techniques to achieve that almost factory look. So we just want to slide it around and get that screw to that opening, and that should allow us to drop it out. So far the dial doesn't look to be damaged by any of the glass. Count ourselves lucky. And I'm just going to put the stem back in so we can align those hands. Oh, so nothing seems to be working. The crown isn't doing anything. That's a bit worrying. But let's just gently remove some of that glass. And try not to slide any of that glass around. Just gently lift. Remove it from the rodico before you go back into the dial. Then we go again, just lifting it off just like that, and I would be happy to report that the dial hasn't suffered any sort of damage whatsoever. If you can imagine, when something like this happens to a watch, it is then moved around so many times from one place to the other, whether that be to and from the repair shop, or if it ends up in an auction, then you can imagine how many times it's handled. And that glass is just floating on the dial, moving around, sometimes quite aggressively. But this one looks like it's survived all that, which is awesome. So since I can't align these hands, I'm gonna have to remove them very carefully, one by one. And we'll add a bit of extra care by removing the hands with plastic tweezers, like so. You have this standard classic Mercedes hands, and I love this splash of green that they've added on this beautiful glossy jet black dial. So one thing about Rolex movements is you never have to fight with anything. So as I was removing the dial, you can see all that other glass that's dropped out that was sitting at the date aperture. Some more here. There's the back of the dial. Beautiful. So if you buy a watch like this and you think, ooh, I'll just clean up the dial, change the crystal and give it a polish, think again. You just never know how far down the rabbit hole the glass has gone, as we will discover as I peel down this movement. You can see the date is currently sitting at 7, so previously it was at 6, and you can see what the glass has done here, where it's slid across or a piece of glass pushed down into the date disc. Apart from that, it all seems okay, but there's still a bit of concern as to why the motion works are not working. So let's remove that date disc and we'll see what's going on underneath. But the GMT work should be just underneath here. We'll just push this little jumper out the way. Okay, now I want to go back onto the other side and remove the balance. I'm just going to inspect to see if there's any more glass here. See some here on that screw and on that wheel just there. And that's probably what scratched up the back of our otherwise very shiny date disc. So this is the reason why we try not to operate anything on a watch with broken glass. So it was probably just as well I was unable to align the hands and that movement wasn't running. And we have that beautiful Parachrom Bleu with the Breguet overcoil, which is some serious Rolex hairspring technology. And I'll let VoiceOver Joe explain it a bit further to you. Take it away, VoiceOver Joe. So again, he's gone off script by removing the balance here. Yeah, I'm sorry, that's the last time. Now, hairsprings have been around for over 300 years and started life usually made from steel. And this medieval metal was very sensitive to magnetic fields and temperature variations. So if it was too hot or too cold, the steel would expand or contract, causing inaccuracies to the timekeeping. We'll give them the benefit of the doubt and say that this is maybe from some glass. Attempts have been made over the years to make different alloys to improve the sensitivity of the hairspring. Rolex invented the Parachrom Bleu, made from niobium and zirconium, and it's probably one of the easiest ways to identify if your Rolex is genuine in a world where Rolex clones have become so good. The Parachrom hairspring with Breguet overcoil is something that hasn't yet been replicated, but that's a topic for another day. Now, most high-end brands, including Rolex, are very secretive and strict when it comes to allowing technical sheets to enter the public space. So you won't find an oiling guide for this Calibre 3186. So you're just gonna have to trust me on this one, as I act all secretive and mysterious and tell you to trust me on this one. You may be a little surprised and shocked at some of the oiling later on, so don't panic and just trust me on this one. As you heard earlier from the main man, I did go off script, but if you want to follow along as per that secretive guide, then remove the rotor and this automatic bridge while the movement is still inside the case. Also let the power down. You can then proceed to removing the movement from the case, followed by the dial and hands. Once you've done that, remove the balance guard and the balance, and then I'm all caught up from the pallet fork onwards. And we can see some more scratches and marks, and again we're going to give this movement the benefit of the doubt and say that this is not from the factory but maybe from the glass, but I haven't seen much glass inside the movement yet so far. Now Rolex would usually reinstall this automatic works once the movement is out and check the end shake of the reversing wheels and adjust if necessary. So I'm just dismantling the automatic works, which you can do at any point, but it's best to do it now and peg the jewels as you go along. And as you can see, there is still a lot of lubrication here even after all these years. Now, should we be shocked by this, or are we to assume that this is a normal amount of lubrication as intended by the manufacturer? Now there's one for you to ponder on and discuss in the comment section. Now there are brands out there with far more beautifully detailed movements than Rolex, but for a mass produced movement, this 3186 isn't half bad. There's some beautiful beveling as you can see on the balance guard. There's some perlage work and even some very subtle snailing. I haven't serviced a clone Rolex movement before, so I can't give you a comparison on how good these finer details are, but I have read that the level of beveling, or the absence of, such as on this balance guard, is also a telltale sign between a real movement and a clone. I'm going to remove the pallet fork. It's a good idea just to remove, just to get rid of the power. Wow, and that's a lot of power in the mainspring, so I'm surprised that the balance wasn't running. He's got separation anxiety, like Germ. That's why you hear him a lot in my videos. Can't get rid of him, but I've locked him up in the basement today for this one. I'm only kidding. I wouldn't lock him up in the cellar. I've just duct taped him to his bed. And now they want us to go on to the other side. So I can see small parts of glass dust everywhere. Look at that, just cheekily sitting there thinking we won't find out. So I'm just removing this cover for the GMT works, which if I remember is not present in its predecessor, the 3185, as it's all incorporated into the date indicator seating, but here we have it as a separate part. Now I mentioned earlier that I didn't see too much broken glass inside the movement, but now that I have this cover off, you can see how far down some of those big chunks of glass have gone. If some of this were to get trapped inside the keyless works or the winding mechanisms and was operated, then it could cause some serious damage, which is what I suspect happened here, hence why we couldn't adjust the hands. And this isn't just any kind of glass. Don't forget this is sapphire, which is just below diamond on the Mohs scale, on the hardness scale. So scratch your eyes out, mate. And there's more. So after removing all the extra GMT works, I then proceed to removing the date seat, which is held in with 4 beautifully blued screws. So hopefully when this top plate comes off, we should be able to see what's going on with our non-functioning motion works and keyless works. So can you see that broken tooth? What happens if I move it away from the broken tooth? You can see how it engages straight away, but as soon as it gets to the broken tooth, the sliding pinion is not catching on that setting wheel, and that's our problem there. And we'll just peg as we go along. Some more glass and a very generous portion of oil just around there. I'm showing you all this because we have to assume that this is our benchmark. So I'm just removing this mechanism cover, and I can see now that the setting wheel is not the only victim of gingivitis and missing teeth. The clutch has lost nearly all of its teeth, which I'll show you later. I don't want to get any marks on my parts. And I kid you not, Rolex just say use the back of your tweezers. Yeah. Nice pool of oil there. This one seems to be okay. Now I'm just removing the hour wheel and the minute wheel with the scorpion sitting on it. It's the jumping hour click, which has a design flaw and has been redesigned by Rolex, and we can see some more drizzle oil everywhere. After removing this calendar wheel and the cam yoke, we can see that even 3 layers down we are still finding big shards of glass. And just look at this cute little cam yoke jewel. Just imagine the process that goes into making a ruby donut. And here we have a 4-way relationship and a recipe for disaster. Ruby, oil, steel and broken sapphire. Rubies, by the way, are also a type of sapphire, did you know? Okay, so we're back into the other side again, and we'll remove the click, the ratchet wheel and this yoke for the sliding gear. Spring as well with it. And we can now remove the barrel bridge, which are 2 1.4mm screws. This part may not look all that glamorous, but if you look at the little beveling just underneath here and here, these little hidden details, and we can slide out the mainspring barrel. Lovely bit of snailing on that mainspring barrel, and nothing on the other side. Boo! Don't think there is much to complain about in terms of excess oil here, or is there? You guys let me know if you think this is excessive. Now I'll remove this winding bridge. Again, we have two 1.4mm screws. Some nice bit of juice on that. Look at the teeth on that. Looks like a turbine from a jet engine. That's what I wanted to be. Aircraft propulsion designer stroke test pilot. Back in the day when we were allowed to have dreams. That's cool, that is. Look at that. Just remove the core. And we'll remove that stop lever there. Okay, before we take this train bridge off, we'll remove this escape wheel capsule. And then we can put it back, the spring back on. And now finally, we can remove the bridge. So are you guys impressed with the up close finishing on this movement so far? Also let me know which other brands you think that have far superior level of detailing than this. I think it's very decent for what Rolex is in terms of pecking order, but the perlage feels as if a robot was trying to play the piano. Now that is the jewel for the escape wheel, which I just removed the cap jewel for, and I would imagine that that was oiled from underneath, so you can see overspill. Deary me, someone tried to stab it with the automatic oiler, but missed a couple of times by the looks of it. Now we can remove all the wheels. Some of you have accused me of being not so enthusiastic about Rolex. It's because he's a rollerphobe. No, I'm not a rollerphobe. And we have this minute pinion bridge. I'm not a rollerphobe. I have family and friends who are Rolex lovers. Even the accountant is a Rolex lover. Oh, that old chestnut. I'm not a racist because my friends are black. That looks a bit crusty, doesn't it? So we're nearly finished with the disassembly and all we have left is the keyless works. So I'll start off by removing the setting lever spring and the jumper. We've got a few marks here and some lovely bit of juice here. One at a time, please. And we can remove that spring now. And that's it really. So I have a clutch from another Rolex movement and you can see how badly damaged our sliding pinion is. So imagine what it takes to rip out all those teeth, and from what we have seen so far, we have to assume that this was all down to the broken sapphire and someone trying to operate the watch in that state. So we have quite a few jewels that we need to remove. We have two for the escape wheel, top and bottom, and the top and bottom for the balance. Usually you see me keep these in for the wash, but Rolex removed theirs, so that's what I'm going to do. Now natural oils usually congeal over time, but modern synthetic oils which would have been used on this movement will evaporate over time, but that obviously hasn't happened here. Ooh, it is what, 2011, it's about 13-14 years old without having had a service. And the lid as well. So now Rolex would install a brand new mainspring and throw the old one away, but let's not be so wasteful, and this mainspring, if serviced correctly, will provide years if not decades of life. So quite a fair few parts for an automatic with date and GMT complication. So since this watch had a smashed up crystal, I don't want to risk having any of that glass going into my cleaning machine and scratching things up while swishing around at neck break speeds. So I'm going to clean everything in some rinse aid in my ultrasonic to try and vibrate all the hidden glass dust into the solution. Right, so in order to do a good finish on the case, I need to dismantle everything including the ceramic bezel. I've seen many Rolex owners easily change the aluminium bezel inserts without any watchmaking experience and with minimum fuss. But I haven't seen anyone doing the ceramic bezels, which are a bit tricky. The aluminium bezels have a lot of flex to them, so they can easily be installed by hand. But ceramic, as you may know, doesn't flex without cracking. Even the guys at Rolex service centers break a few of these during service. So keep watching till the end as I attempt to reinstall the ceramic inset. Oh dear, so you can see the years of build-up that occurs under the bezel, and it looks pretty gross. Now you can use a press to push out the glass, but our crystal is already damaged, and when else am I ever going to be able to take a hammer to a Rolex? And that's exactly what I've been egged on into doing by trouble. You ready?
Yeah.
That was fun. So I want to use the lapping machine to get a nice clean finish on the bezel, and I use a press to remove the ceramic insert. Make sure your bottom die supports the metal rim of the bezel and has space for the insert to fall into. On the aluminium bezel inserts, this is easily done by hand, but on these ceramic ones, you will need some sort of press. Grey nostril hair. Nice. That's definitely not mine. Now looking at the case at arm's length, it doesn't look too bad, but up close you can see all the scratches and dings. But I don't want to do anything drastic, because it still has its shape and straight lines, so I don't need to use the lapping machine and end up removing metal. So let me explain scratches. There are a few different types of scratches that can occur on a watch. One type of scratch is when some of the metal from your watch is lost forever to whatever object it got dragged on, like when you scratch someone and their skin ends up under your fingernail. Another type of scratch is when instead of a drag, it's a quick knock on something sharp that parts the metal, like when the sea was parted for Moses. The sea didn't go anywhere and it came back together again. So the metal hasn't gone anywhere, it's just parted. Another type of mark is a ding, and that's when the metal has been pushed in and displaced. And again, in this situation, the metal hasn't gone anywhere, but all the atoms have just been rearranged, like when a ball hits your face in slow motion. So this watch has the triple lock system, which is indicated by the 3 dots you usually see on the crown. It has 3 seal zones, 1 gasket inside the crown and 2 inside the tube. It also has 1 on the outside of the tube and 1 on the end of the tube, so that's 5 altogether. Very thorough. And we'll check the water resistance later on. Forgot to put my bleeding teeth in today, didn't I? So I want a really flat mop, so I'm going to dress the mop first. So the reason why I gave you a lecture on the various types of scratches known to mankind is because our case has a lot of those marks where the metal has just been displaced. So I'm going to use this method of applying heat and speed to try and move some of that metal around and see if we can pull those marks and dings out and bring all those parted C's back together again. Dressing the mop and making sure it has a flat surface will enable us to maintain the flat shape of the sides on the case. So let's see how we're doing so far. Still a fair way to go, so we'll just carry on like that, take it slowly so that we don't lose the shape, and see if we can get those dings out. So with the case back, you can see there are various steps with various finishes. So I'm going to have to use various techniques to get all the correct finishes on the correct spots. I'll lap the polish section with a very fine grit, and again I must make sure I have the correct angle, otherwise I'll end up buggering up all the lines. There was a deep nick on a tricky spot where two different lines meet, and it's sometimes best not to fight too hard with those and just let them be, otherwise you end up losing the original shape of the part. There is a circular satin grain on the flat outer perimeter of the case back, so I do that on the lathe. And here I am cleaning all the parts after the second cut in preparation for my final finish, and I dress my finishing mop to make sure it is absolutely clean of any old compound and bits of metal that could scratch up my final finish. So you saw me using the grey cutting compound at the beginning, and now I'm using this green one, which is finishing compound for stainless steel. I just quickly buff the polished sections on this case back with a few passes. Now when you're buffing sharp lines like this case, make sure not to press too hard, otherwise the case will sink into those extra folds on the mop and start touching the edges. So, what do you reckon? Work should also be applied after the final stage of polishing, so I just tape up the polished center section and brush the outer links. Now it's time to give everything one final clean, and I use 2 baths for this, one with cleaning solution and one to rinse with just water. I try to avoid the parts coming into contact with any steel in the cleaning pan, as steel versus steel could cause some tiny blemishes to the parts. That one right on the corner there, still there, because it's just right on that angle, isn't it? So to get rid of that completely, we'd have to remove a lot of metal, so we just left it there as it is. It's alright. So now I'm greasing up all the O-rings and gaskets so that I can pressure test this case. I install the tube and I use a bit of Loctite. Radical. I install the crown, which will also help me align the crystal. One of those notches on that ratchet ring needs to align with the crown, and this ring is what also holds in our gasket and crystal. So now that I have installed the crystal, screwed down the case back and the crown, our case should be airtight. I stick it in this sealed chamber and pump in air. If there is any leaks on our case, then that pressurized air should also enter inside the case through the leaks. I then release the air from the chamber. If any pressurized air went inside our case, it should now rush out, and the water helps us see those leaks, but this case seems to be tight. You may see some bubbles coming out from underneath the bezel, or in our test we can see some bubbles coming out from the spring bar because we just pumped in air into every crevice. Okay, so before we start assembling the movement, we need to do some prep work, and these are the parts that need to be treated with epilam. Epilam is basically, as that old saying goes, water off a duck's back, if you know what I mean. It's very expensive and evaporates very quickly. It's recommended to soak for about a minute, then dry for about 6 minutes on some absorbent paper. I'll be using an air dryer for a couple of minutes. I won't soak the palette fork with this lot, as the pallet fork needs only to be soaked halfway so that the jewels are immersed. Epilam is quite expensive, but if you're charging £500 for a Rolex service, then a bit of loss through evaporation has to be considered. So you do need to dip this in for at least a minute. There's no point just dipping it while it's in the atmosphere because it will just evaporate straight away. So what I've done is got my little jar, got my pallet fork, I've built a stalactite, and I'm just going to syringe a little bit in there and we'll leave it in there for about a minute. You can see. So I've got my genuine replacement parts, so let's assemble this thing. The oils you'll need for this are HP 1300, 9010, some MR4 which is basically Mobius 9501, some 9415 for the pallet, and since we are reusing our mainspring and barrel, you need some braking grease. While you're at it, you'll also need some Formalin or foam lube for your case parts. Now if you're just starting out on this hobby, you may have difficulty with your mainspring, so practice on some spare ones. And most Swiss mainsprings face clockwise when they are in the barrel, so you want it to go anti-clockwise onto your tool. So here you can see it's anti-clockwise in the tool. Here I am applying some braking grease because an automatic mainspring is constantly being wound as it sits on your wrist, so when it's fully wound it needs to be able to slip round against the barrel wall. Now Rolex say not to oil the mainspring under the assumption that a new spring is being installed which is already coated, but since our mainspring has been through the cleaning machine, we assume that the grease busting solutions have removed that coating. So I'm just applying a bit of HP 1300 and that should seep in and spread. I apply a bit of HP 1300 to the contact point of the barrel lid and arbor and wipe off any excess. My automatic oiler has been broken for years, so you do usually see me use my hand pube oiler, but we will need something like this to oil some of the jewels. Since my balance is still on the movement from the cleaning process, I'll oil the jewel with some 9010 and install it before I remove the balance. I'll also do the rest of the removable jewels which also need to be oiled with 9010. And I think that's it for the use of 9010 on this movement. I'm getting all the jewels in for top and bottom, the balance and escape wheel, and I've oiled this one as well as before. So I'm just going to do a few more sub-assemblies. So I'll do the winding bridge, and this is the core. You put a little bit of, as Rolex like to call it, MR4 or Gizmo, which is basically 9501. So this is the crown wheel which needs to freely rotate around the shouldered screw. So we put a bit of the blue goo here. So naturally most of us would just assume that you put a bit of D5 on the center jewel or just at the base of this mini pinion, but Rolex tell us to use a bit of the MR4. So now that the movement is clean, we can see all that customary Rolex detailing up close. And maybe I was a bit harsh earlier with my robot playing the piano comment, because I thought the perlage looked a bit soulless, like it was done by a machine. And yes, there are top tier brands that have far better finishing, such as Patek, Alanga, Audemars Piguet, and even JLC, but Rolex doesn't class itself as a top tier brand, and in its earlier years it positioned itself as a bit of a geek, trying to produce tool watches for nerdy professions. They also want some on the teeth, and that will be touching the setting wheel. Now usually I just put some on the wall on the main plate where this sits. Rolex suggests you just put a little bit on the back, so that's what we'll do. Now because this goes into a square hole in the winding pinion, we oil all four sides because this won't get to rotate. Okay, so I had to do that off camera so as not to get the grease everywhere. And now we can move on to the rest of the keyless works. Do you know why it's called the keyless?
Because they used to use a key on everything, but then it didn't work out well, so then they just used the keyless. I don't know how to...
So I don't think I can explain it any better than Trouble. We used to use a key back in the day to wind the mainspring, and when they invented a system that didn't require the key, they called it the keyless. So as I was saying previously, in its earlier years, Rolex was a geeky brand, trying to produce tool watches for nerds, such as scientists, explorers, divers, seafarers, automobilists, and pilots. What a load of nerdy professions they are, right? Rolex weren't really that fussed about the luxury market, but due to clever marketing, it is now the most famous watch brand in the whole world, synonymous with luxury and wealth. And with that famous coronet as its logo, your average Joe on the street would naturally crown it as the king of all watch brands. If you were to strike up a conversation about horology with a lost tribe in the Amazon rainforest, the first word that would come out of their mouth in that conversation would probably be, "Ah, Rolex." But even though the whole world sees it as a luxury brand, Rolex at its core still adheres to that tool watch heritage.
So a HP 1300.
So you'll see me use a lot of that blue stuff in a lot of positions, where on an ETA we would use some D5 or HP 1300. But if there are any Rolex watchmakers watching, please let us know if I'm doing this to Rolex specs. And if you see me doing something wrong, then don't embarrass me in front of the kids and my subscribers.
Let's get this on in one go.
You also saw that I installed the keyless way before anything else, unlike most of the other movements and ETA movements that I've done, and that is the assembly and disassembly order as per the Rolex Service Center for this movement, if you're following along.
Well, the snoring came from my mom. She just woke up.
She's a snorer. So before we put that winding bridge back on, they do ask us to put a little bit of grease in between the grooves of those teeth, like so, you can see. Now this 3186 movement was first introduced in 2005 and replaced the previous GMT movement used by Rolex, the 3185, which was in service since 1989. The 3186 has a power reserve of around 2 days and beats at 28,800 beats per hour, and is a chronometer certified movement, so it's accurate within -4 to +6 seconds a day. Is that you singing? Just don't.
I got tattoos from my trousers.
Now all these jewels are oiled using HP 1300. So this is the core for the intermediate crown wheel, and we put some grease on that ledge and some on the base. It's hard for me to explain all the exact positions where the oils go, but they are very specific, so you may have to pause the video to see each position. We put some in between the teeth of the intermediate crown wheel, as this will be meshing with the crown wheel underneath, and all this probably adds to that smoothness you get when you wind such a Rolex movement. I apply some HP 1300 on this yoke for the sliding gear and spin it in, and I put a bit of grease underneath the screw.
I think the color's still there.
That was a big gulp. Uh-oh, James here. He always comes at the pivotal moment. Whenever you hear a rattling noise, that's him.
1300.
He always has to have something in his hand, whether it's a banana or a tub of chewing gum. It's some sort of sensory comforting thing. There aren't any banking pins for the pallet fork. And now he's going to try and climb on my back while I'm trying to install the balance. Let's give it a few winds, and that is smooth as butter, that is. Oof. Hey, look what you just nearly did. Made me slip my screwdriver into the balance. So do you remember the sermon I gave you about the epilam? Well, now that the balance is in, you can see that the movement is running and our escape wheel and pallet fork are going at it hammer and tongue. And we let it run dry like this for about 20 minutes before we oil. Well, that's the only time you're ever going to need this. That bottle will last you probably 1,000 years before it goes out of date, that is. It's 2030. And you can see it is quite thick compared to the normal 914. I suppose so it doesn't fly off because of the high speeds involved. So you can see how thoughtful Rolex have been. Instead of having to remove the balance again, they've provided this little access hole so that we can oil our pallet from the dial side. And we don't oil the pallet fork jewels, instead we put a bit on the teeth. And then we unhack it and let it run for a bit. Hack it again and do another tooth. We don't need to oil all the teeth, but a few times to get all the teeth and pallet jewels covered. See what it looks like so far. So I'll just let that settle before I adjust it or regulate it. So now I'm just installing all of the GMT works, and if you're enjoying this video so far, please hit that like and subscribe button. So I'm oiling this jewel with HP 1300 for the bottom pivot of the intermediate date wheel, as we won't have access to it later. That blue around the center of this wheel is not grease, but seems to be some sort of heat treatment reaction or chemical reaction. And we do need to engage that and push that down, and we can give everything a nice clean. So we have our intermediate setting wheel and our broken setting wheel. We have our Rolex part to replace the broken one. So before I install the date seat, I apply a bit of HP 1300 here. So if you remember, we already oiled up this jewel. We'll just oil up these two here. We won't have access to them afterwards. And again, this is all HP 1300. So as I mentioned earlier, a chronometer certified movement has to be within -4 to +6 seconds a day, and our movement is around +12 seconds a day. So adjust the rate using the microstellar tool.
Haha, me mateys! It's Captain Cook here! Haha!
You can see the star-shaped opening on the tool, and there are 4 star-shaped screws on the balance wheel, 2 short ones and 2 long ones. Adjusting the screw inwards will speed up the balance, and vice versa. There's an index on the handle of the tool, so one turn on the short screw will adjust by 1 second per day, and the long screw by 2 seconds. Any screw that is adjusted also needs to have the same adjustment done to its opposite screw to keep the balance in balance. This can be fiddly, so I'll fine tune it off camera. The beat error, however, is much more simple. It can be adjusted via the lever on the balance bridge. If you watch the 2 lines on the monitor, you'll see how they come together. Here we are so far, after a bit more regulation. So I'll let this settle for a day or two, and I'm sure I can get that rate down to 0. So now I'm just assembling the automatic works, and we use HP 1300 for all the points. If you remember, we did treat the reversing wheels in epilam, so we can sort of figure out the reasoning. The pallet fork and escape wheel are 2 parts with a high frequency of movement, and so is the automatic works. Imagine when the watch is on your wrist while you swing your golf bat. The rotor is gonna go crazy, and the oil also has a chance of going for a walkabout where it's not supposed to. So we can understand why those parts were also treated. So time to install this dial, and I make sure the back is clean from any glass dust, and also do a finer clean on the face, making sure I've got every speck of glass dust off, and I also do the same for the hands. Now usually GMTs have 2 colors on the bezel for day and night, But on this one, being the first ceramic GMT, Rolex couldn't figure out how to do colours on ceramic bezels yet. This model is now discontinued, and some have predicted that with all these factors makes for a future classic that collectors fight for at auction houses to add to their collections. Ooh, so now the moment of truth. I'm a bit nervous about installing this ceramic bezel as it could crack, and that's 500 quid to replace. So I apply some foam bleed to this ratchet ring and then install the ratchet spring, making sure that it lines up at 12. I also apply some grease to the 3 points on the spring, which will slide into the bezel. This is the gasket that holds in the bezel to the case and doesn't really serve any other purpose such as water resistancy. The aluminium inserts can be installed with the bezel still off the watch, but with the ceramic ones this is the correct order to do it. The bezel needs to be installed first. The insert has a bank profile, so make sure the die you use also has a bank profile to support most or at least the outer perimeter of the insert, and then you should either hear a click or a crack. Phew, that's a relief. It took me a couple of presses to get it fully seated, but it all looks good. Now on this one, we oil around the rim of that jewel. So it's time to finish this thing off by installing the automatic works. You'll have noticed I installed the complete movement into the case before fitting the bezel insert, and that's to help line up the insert accurately with the 12 o'clock marker on the dial. With some HP 1300 here, and that's the end of the oiling. And let's see how close I've got the date changeover. Close. So I'm nearly done here, friends. Whether you're a Rolex fan or not, we can still appreciate good craftsmanship, and this one was a pleasure to work on. Let me know what you guys think of this piece in the comments. So thank you all for chilling out with me today, and I hope you learned something along the way. It's a joy to gain new knowledge, and I learn something new in the comments from you guys every day. Look after yourselves, friends, and take care of each other. Peace, love, and blessings to you all. And if the Almighty wills, I'll see you on the next one. Ta-ra a bit.